4 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I discovered my entire wedding had been canceled. It was not a hacker. It was my own mother. She forged my signature, convinced that losing $50,000 would force me to crawl back and beg for her help. She wanted me humiliated and broken, but on my wedding day, she was the one walking into a trap. It was my own mother. She forged my signature, entirely convinced losing $50,000 would force me to crawl back and beg for her help. She wanted me humiliated and broken, but she had no idea that on my wedding day, the only one walking into a final trap would be her. My name is Chloe Watson. I am 31 years old, and I make my living as a claims analyst for Harbor and Rent Assurance in Asheville, North Carolina. My entire professional life revolves around assessing damage, reviewing policy limits, and determining fault. I spend 40 hours a week looking at the wreckage of other people's lives and figuring out exactly where the structural integrity failed. Yet, when it came to the foundation of my own family, I was completely blind to the rot creeping up the walls. I really should have seen the collapse coming. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. My boyfriend, Ronan Hale, and I were sitting on the scuffed hardwood floor of the bungalow we had spent the last 8 months renovating with our own hands. We were exhausted, covered in a thin layer of drywall dust, eating pad thai straight out of the cardboard takeout containers. There was a lingering scent of fresh primer in the air, mixed with the smell of peanut sauce and rain tapping against the newly installed window panes. It was not a glamorous setting, but it was perfectly ours. Ronan set his plastic fork down, wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, and reached into the pocket of his paint-stained jeans. He did not hire a secret photographer. He did not arrange a flash mob or hide the ring in a glass of champagne. He just pulled out a small velvet box, looked at me with those incredibly steady, grounding gray eyes of his, and asked if I wanted to spend the next 60 years building a life in this exact house with him. I did not hesitate. I said yes with my whole heart before he even finished getting the question out. For the next 8 minutes, we sat on that dusty floor, completely wrapped in each other, dreaming out loud about the future. I knew exactly what kind of wedding I wanted. I did not want a massive spectacle. I wanted a small, warm, elegantly understated evening. I had my heart set on Juniper Hall, an old glass factory on the edge of town that had been beautifully converted into an open-air greenhouse. I pictured the evening bathed in rich, earthy tones like brushed bronze and deep olive green. I wanted the tables lined with mismatched amber glass bottles filled with hand-picked wildflowers. I wanted the soft, resonant sounds of an acoustic string quartet playing in the background while our closest friends drank wine under the stars. It was supposed to feel like a warm, intimate embrace. Exactly 9 minutes after I put the ring on my finger, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden floorboards. The screen illuminated the dark room, flashing my mother's name, Judith Watson. I picked it up immediately, my chest still heaving with happy tears, eager to share the best news of my entire life. "Mom," I breathed into the receiver, my voice trembling with pure joy. Ronan just proposed. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. She did not gasp in delight. She did not ask to see the ring. She did not even ask if I was happy. "Well," my mother finally said. Her voice dripped with that signature sweet frost she had perfected over decades. "I suppose we have a massive amount of work to do. What is the working budget? Have you drafted a preliminary guest list? Please tell me you have an acceptable venue in mind, Chloe, and who exactly is going to be your general coordinator?" The glowing warmth in my chest instantly turned into a block of ice. "Mom, it literally just happened less than 10 minutes ago. We were thinking about Juniper Hall. Just a small, simple ceremony with our closest people." A soft, profoundly patronizing sigh echoed through the speaker. It was the exact sound she made when I brought home a bad grade on a math test in middle school. "Chloe, darling, listen to yourself. A Watson wedding is never just a simple ceremony. You know perfectly well that our family name still holds a great deal of weight in the local social circles. You cannot possibly manage a proper, dignified event on your own. You work in an insurance cubicle, sweetheart. You do not throw high society galas. I felt the familiar, crushing weight of my childhood conditioning pressing down heavily on my shoulders. I had been taught from a very young age that disappointing Judith Watson was not just a mistake. It was an act of profound, unforgivably selfish ingratitude. She was a mother who had worked tirelessly to maintain our image, and she made sure I never forgot the sacrifices she supposedly made. "I know, Mom," I murmured, my spine curving forward slightly in defeat. "I just want it to be intimate and meaningful." Ronan was watching me closely from across the room. He did not say a single word, but his brow furrowed deeply. Ronan is an exceptionally perceptive man. He could hear the sharp shift in the room's energy. He realized instantly that my mother was not speaking like a joyous parent celebrating her daughter's romantic milestone. She sounded exactly like a ruthless corporate project manager preparing to execute a hostile takeover. 2 days later, we hosted an informal engagement brunch at the bungalow. My best friend and newly appointed maid of honor, Tessa Boone, arrived an hour early to help set up. Tessa is a senior event production manager for a major corporate firm. She breathes logistical spreadsheets and eats vendor contracts for breakfast. She is also fiercely protective of me. About 45 minutes into the gathering, my mother made her grand entrance. Judith swept through the front door wearing a flawless tailored linen suit, entirely ignoring the fact that we were eating bagels off paper plates. She was all dazzling smiles, kissing cheeks and graciously accepting congratulations from my friends, as if she were the one who had just gotten engaged. Tessa watched her every move from the corner of the kitchen. Her eyes narrowed with immediate, primal suspicion. The first real crack in the foundation happened when I stepped out to the backyard to greet Ronan's brother. I had foolishly left the preliminary deposit contract for Juniper Hall sitting right on top of the kitchen island. I had proudly signed it earlier that very morning, securing our date. When I walked back inside to grab a fresh bottle of sparkling water from the refrigerator, I caught her in the act. Tessa saw it too. My mother was standing over the kitchen island, holding her sleek silver smartphone directly over my paperwork. With practiced, terrifying stealth, she snapped a clear, high-resolution photograph of the contract. I knew exactly what that lens was capturing: the vendor contact details, the strict payment schedule, and my authorized signature at the bottom. She swiftly slipped the phone back into her designer leather purse before she even realized Tessa was staring a hole right through her skull. "Just keeping a little record for the family scrapbook," my mother said smoothly. She did not miss a single beat. Completely unfazed by Tessa's furious glare, Tessa crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her posture rigid and combative. "That is a legally binding financial document, Mrs. Watson. It is not a photograph of a wedding cake." My mother ignored Tessa's comment entirely. She turned her dazzling, dangerous smile directly onto me, stepping forward to gently cup my face. "Chloe, sweetie, there is simply too much on your plate right now with your demanding little job and this house renovation. Let me just help you with the first few calls. Just the initial outreach to make sure these local vendors are treating you right. You know how these people love to take advantage of young, naive brides." It was a trap perfectly wrapped in maternal concern. I knew it, deep down in the pit of my stomach, but the alternative was a screaming match right there in my newly renovated kitchen, in front of Ronan's family. It would cause a massive rift that would inevitably taint the entire wedding planning process. I was exhausted. I just wanted peace. I foolishly believed that if I let my mother feel important and included, she would not feel the need to lash out and ruin things. "Okay, Mom," I said softly, dropping my gaze to the scuffed floorboards. "Just the first few calls. Just to help." "Exactly, darling. Just to help," she purred, patting my cheek with an icy hand that made me shiver. I looked over at Ronan, who was watching the entire exchange with tight lips and a clenched jaw. I looked at Tessa, who looked like she wanted to flip the heavy kitchen island completely upside down. I genuinely thought I was managing the situation. I thought giving my mother an inch would satisfy her ego and stop her from taking the entire mile. I was an absolute fool. I did not realize it right then, standing in the morning light of my kitchen, but the terrible truth was already locked in motion. The very moment I said a joyful yes to the man I loved, my mother had quietly launched a systematic, calculated campaign to tear my entire world apart. It started under the guise of professional expertise. My mother owned a moderately successful boutique interior design firm called JW Living. She had built her entire career on convincing wealthy clients that their own tastes were entirely inadequate and that only she could save them from their own aesthetic mediocrity. She seamlessly applied this exact business model to my wedding. She did not ask for permission to take the reins. She simply informed my hired wedding planner, Celia Pike, that JW Living would be acting as the senior design consultant for the event to ensure the visual branding met the family standard. Within 48 hours of that initial brunch, my mother had carbon copied herself onto every single email chain I had generated. She was corresponding directly with the florist, the rental equipment company, the acoustic band, and even the shuttle service coordinating the guest transportation. At first, the changes were subtle, framed as minor vendor upgrades that she generously offered to cover through her corporate accounts. But soon, my entire vision began to evaporate. The earthy, relaxed atmosphere I had spent months dreaming about was being systematically scrubbed clean. I would open an email thread to find that the local, hand-picked wildflowers had been scrapped entirely without my consent. In their place were towering, structured arrangements of imported white orchids and sterile hydrangeas. The warm, dripping beeswax candles I loved were swapped out for monolithic crystal candelabras that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby. The simple though rustic wooden crossback chairs I had carefully selected were quietly canceled and replaced with heavy, tufted velvet seating. When I tried to call the rental company to reverse the chair order, the representative cheerfully informed me that all inventory changes had to be formally approved by the primary account manager. I was the bride, but in their system, I had been demoted to a secondary contact. "Chloe, darling, I am merely elevating the experience," she said during one particularly tense phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. "You simply do not understand the spatial flow of a venue like Juniper Hall. Wood and weeds will make it look like a barn dance. I am giving you a sophisticated profile. You should be thanking me for stepping in before you embarrassed yourself." The physical aesthetic was just the beginning. The guest list was the next territory she conquered. Ronan and I had originally agreed on a strict maximum of 80 people. We wanted to look out at the crowd and recognize every single face. By the third week of planning, the guest count had mysteriously ballooned to over 150. Then it hit 175. I began receiving updated spreadsheets from Celia, populated with names of people I had never met in my entire life. There were former business partners of my mother, corporate sponsors of JW Living, and the entire executive board of the City Women's Club. She claimed these invitations were absolutely essential for maintaining our family image in the local business community. While her network expanded like an invasive vine, the space allocated for Ronan's family began to shrink in deeply confusing ways. He has a large, boisterous extended family from Ohio. Suddenly, his cousins were being cut from the final catering count. His aunts and uncles were being moved to a backup list. The seating chart went through 5 revisions in a single week, and each time, the first 3 rows of the ceremony space were filled almost exclusively with people who only knew Judith Watson. It was as if my groom was a minor supporting character in a theatrical production starring my mother's social circle. When I finally broke down and confronted her about the seating chart, she did not yell. She never yelled. Instead, she deployed her most devastating weapon, the tragic martyrdom of the single mother. Her voice cracked perfectly. She sighed, a long, ragged sound of profound disappointment. "Chloe," she whispered, sounding utterly exhausted, "I carried this family on my back for 20 years. I worked 80 hours a week to make sure you had a roof over your head and a name that meant something in this town. I am simply asking to share this one joyous occasion with the people who supported me through those dark times. If having my friends there to celebrate my only daughter is too much of a burden for you, just say the word. I will cancel all of their invitations today. I will sit alone in the back row. Is that what you want? For me to be entirely isolated? She knew exactly how to twist the knife. I felt completely paralyzed by a toxic mixture of guilt and lifelong obligation. I backed down. I always back down. I swallowed my frustration and told her the expanded guest list was fine. Tessa, however, possessed an absolute immunity to Judith Watson that I completely lacked. As a seasoned event producer, Tessa recognized a hostile takeover when she saw one. She did not waste her breath arguing with my mother in public. Instead, she went entirely underground. Whenever we met for coffee, Tessa would pull out her encrypted tablet. While I cried about the velvet chairs and the orchids, Tessa was quietly downloading every single contract my mother had touched. She took high-resolution screenshots of the cancellation clauses. She highlighted the non-refundable deposit terms, the strict 30-day refund windows, and the primary contact protocols. She hunted down the original phone numbers for the vendors, bypassing the JW Living letterheads my mother had plastered over everything. Tessa was meticulously building a war room right under my nose. Ronan was the one who spotted the most insidious detail of all. We were sitting on the sofa late one Friday night, reviewing a catering invoice that had somehow doubled in price. Ronan leaned closer to the glowing screen. His brow furrowed deeply. He pointed his index finger at the top right corner of the document. Under the primary contact section, there was an email address I did not recognize. It used my first and last name, followed by the word weddings, but the domain belonged entirely to my mother's design firm. Chloe, did you set this up? Ronan asked, his voice low and incredibly tight. Because this implies you work for her company, and it routes all communication directly to her servers. I called my mother immediately, my heart pounding against my ribs. She answered on the second ring, sounding utterly unfazed. Oh, that it is just a work backup account. Sweetie, she lied effortlessly. Celia's emails were bouncing back from your personal address because of those massive attachment sizes. I just set up a quick forwarding alias on my server to make sure no important design documents slipped through the cracks. It is purely administrative. Do not worry your pretty head about it. Let me handle the boring technical details. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe that my mother was simply an overbearing perfectionist who lacked basic boundaries, but the cold, hard reality was beginning to seep through the walls of my denial. Every altered contract, every replaced flower, every stranger added to the guest list was a calculated move. She was not trying to help me build a beautiful wedding. She was systematically locking me out of my own event. She was positioning herself as the sole authority, the only signatory, the singular voice that the vendors listened to. The control had been completely and totally transferred. She was holding all the keys, and I was just a guest at an event bearing my name. It began not with a loud argument, but with a quiet invitation. On a Tuesday afternoon, my mother called Ronan directly, entirely bypassing me. She suggested they meet for lunch at a very high-end French bistro downtown. She framed it as a necessary step, a quiet conversation between adults, before he officially merged his entire life with our family. Ronan agreed, assuming it was a standard, albeit slightly formal, mother-in-law bonding effort. He arrived 10 minutes early. She was already seated in a secluded corner booth, sipping sparkling water with a sliver of lime, looking every inch the concerned matriarch. She did not waste any time on pleasantries. After the waiter poured their wine, she leaned across the crisp white tablecloth and lowered her voice to a deeply conspiratorial whisper. She told him she felt a profound moral obligation to warn him about my deeply concerning financial history. She painted a vivid, tragic picture of a daughter who chronically hid bills, accumulated crushing debt, and routinely forced the family to absorb the massive collateral damage of her reckless choices. She used words like volatile and unstable. She looked at him with sad, pitying eyes, implying that he was walking into a trap of my making. The reality of that debt was something I wore like a quiet badge of honor, not a scarlet letter. When I was 24 years old, my father suffered a severe stroke. I took out personal loans, maxed out multiple credit cards, and drained my meager savings to cover the specialized rehabilitation facilities that my mother flatly refused to pay for. She claimed the medical bills would completely bankrupt her design firm and ruin her social standing. I worked 3 jobs for 5 straight years to pay off every single cent of that medical debt so my father could learn how to walk again. I settled the final balance over 2 years ago. Yet, sitting in that dim bistro, my mother weaponized the darkest, most painful chapter of my life, twisting an act of desperate love into a fundamental character flaw. Ronan did not take the bait. He knew exactly where that money had gone because I had told him everything on our 3rd date. He sat there, carefully cutting his steak, his expression completely unreadable. He did not defend me loudly or cause a public scene. He simply let her talk, silently observing how effortlessly she could take a deeply private, vulnerable piece of my past and forge it into a blade. When he came home that night and recounted the entire conversation to me, he held my hands very tightly in his. He realized long before I did that she was not just being difficult about napkin colors. She was actively gathering ammunition to isolate me. The campaign of isolation moved swiftly from my fiancé to my outer circle. A week after that lunch, I went in for my second dress fitting. The seamstress, a sweet older woman named Maria, was unusually quiet as she pinned the hem of my simple ivory silk gown. She kept glancing at me through the large vanity mirror, her eyes filled with obvious pity. Finally, she stopped pinning, stood up, and placed a gentle hand on my arm. She asked, in a very soft, hesitant voice, if the wedding was being indefinitely postponed. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. I asked her why she would ever think that. Maria looked away, nervously smoothing the silk fabric. She told me my mother had stopped by the shop 2 days prior. She had looked incredibly distressed, sighing heavily while inspecting my veil, and casually mentioned to the staff that the family was dealing with some severe, unexpected internal issues that might force a massive change of plans. I brushed it off to Maria with a forced, bright laugh, blaming it on typical wedding stress, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely unbutton my dress to take it off. The whispers did not stop at the bridal boutique. They followed me right into the fluorescent-lit hallways of Harbor and Wren Assurance. The very next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I received an urgent calendar invite for a mandatory meeting with the head of human resources. I sat in a stiff leather chair while the director, looking deeply uncomfortable, explained that they had received a bizarre, anonymous phone call. A woman had contacted the main reception desk, claiming to be a concerned local vendor, and specifically asked if I was currently under any sort of internal financial investigation by the company. The caller heavily implied that my employment status was precarious due to extremely poor personal judgment. I felt all the blood drain entirely from my face. I had to sit in that corporate office and explain to human resources that I was going through a highly contentious family dispute regarding my upcoming wedding, and the call was likely a malicious harassment tactic. They were sympathetic, noting my flawless professional record over the past 4 years, and closed the inquiry immediately, but the damage was absolutely done. I walked out of that office feeling dirty, exposed, and intensely paranoid. My mother was no longer just controlling the seating chart. She was actively trying to destabilize my livelihood and my professional reputation. Then, she aimed for the softest target she could possibly find. Elaine Hale, Ronan's mother, is a gentle, retired kindergarten teacher who lives in a quiet suburb in Ohio. She believes the best in everyone and avoids conflict at all costs. My mother called her on a Sunday morning. Under the guise of bonding over the extreme stress of wedding planning, she casually planted a massive seed of doubt. She told Elaine how worried she was about Ronan, implying heavily that I was bringing massive, untold financial burdens into their new marriage. She framed it as a mother-to-mother confession, a tearful plea for Elaine to keep a very close eye on her son's bank accounts once we were officially married. Elaine called Ronan immediately, her voice trembling with intense anxiety. Ronan spent 2 solid hours on the phone painstakingly untangling the lies, explaining the absolute truth about my father's medical bills, and reassuring his mother that my credit score was actually higher than his own. When Tessa found out about the human resources incident and the toxic phone call to Elaine, she practically kicked my front door down. She paced aggressively across my living room rug, her eyes blazing with a fierce protective fury. She stopped directly in front of me, pointing a firm finger at my chest. "You have to stop talking to her on the phone," Tessa demanded, her voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. "From this exact second forward, every single piece of communication you have with Judith Watson happens in writing. Text messages, emails, certified mail if you have to. You need an ironclad paper trail, because she is actively gaslighting you and everyone around you. She is building a false narrative that you are unstable so that when she finally pulls the plug on this whole event, everyone will simply think it was your fault." I sat on the couch, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. I heard everything Tessa was saying. Logically, the evidence was glaringly obvious. The lunch with Ronan, the seamstress, the anonymous call to my office, the manipulation of Elaine. It was a perfectly executed strategy of psychological character assassination. Yet, a stubborn, terrified part of my brain desperately clung to the fragile hope that it was just a series of terrible, unfortunate misunderstandings. I told myself that a mother does not actively try to destroy her own daughter. That happens in thriller novels, not in real life. I nodded quietly at Tessa, promising I would be careful, but I still hesitated to put up the massive iron wall she was demanding. I was utterly terrified that drawing a hard line in the sand would trigger the exact explosion I was desperately trying to avoid. I foolishly believed I could still manage the fallout. Tessa looked at my face and saw exactly what I was thinking. She knew I was still fundamentally paralyzed by a lifetime of emotional conditioning. She did not argue with me anymore. She just hugged me tightly, told me she loved me, and left the house. What I did not know, and what I would not discover until the ground completely fell out from under me, was what Tessa did the exact moment she got into her car. She did not drive home. She pulled into a quiet parking lot, opened her laptop, and initiated a massive contingency plan. She firmly believed that the psychological warfare my mother was currently waging was merely the opening act. The real catastrophe, the fatal blow, was still waiting in the wings. Using her own corporate credit card and leveraging every single professional favor she had accumulated over a decade in the event industry, Tessa quietly placed a non-refundable deposit on a secondary venue. It was a place called Foxmere Station, an old industrial train depot located 30 miles outside the city limits. She drafted a phantom timeline, secured tentative holds with backup vendors, and locked down a secondary security team. She did not breathe a single word of this to me. She knew that if I knew there was a safety net, I might accidentally tip my hand to my mother. Tessa operated in absolute terrifying silence, preparing for a war I still blindly refused to believe was actually happening. The first alarms did not ring loudly. They came as a series of quiet, confusing questions that made me feel like I was slowly losing my grip on reality. It started on a rainy Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks before the ceremony. I was sitting at my desk at the insurance firm, trying to focus on a liability claim, when my cell phone buzzed. It was the lead designer from the floral company. She was calling to cheerfully confirm the final invoice for the massive structural installations and to ensure I was completely satisfied with the newly revised color palette. I sat perfectly still in my office chair. I asked her, keeping my voice as steady as possible, what exactly she meant by a newly revised color palette. She politely read back the details of an order I had never seen, outlining thousands of dollars in exotic white orchids and silver-painted foliage, completely erasing any trace of the warm organic tones I had chosen. Before I could even untangle that mess, an email notification popped up on my computer screen from the rental company. The logistics coordinator wanted to know why we were suddenly dropping nearly a third of the seating on the groom's side of the aisle. He needed my final approval on the newly asymmetrical floor plan. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck. I immediately logged into the central vendor portal. Navigating to the signed contracts folder, there it was. A legally binding change order document, authorizing a massive reduction in chairs for Ronan's family, and right at the bottom was my signature. It was a perfectly executed digital signature, bearing my exact name, time-stamped at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. I had been fast asleep in my bed next to Ronan at that exact hour. I had never opened that file. I had never even received the notification that it existed. I called Tessa the minute I got home. She arrived within 20 minutes, carrying her heavy encrypted laptop and a look of grim determination. We sat at my kitchen table, the glowing screen illuminating her sharp features. I showed her the signed documents and the confirmation emails from the vendors. Tessa did not just look at the text, she dug straight into the hidden architecture of the messages. She opened the raw metadata of the emails that had supposedly been sent by me to the vendors. "Look right here, Chloe," Tessa instructed, pointing a manicured finger at a string of complex routing data buried deep in the email headers. "The display name says it is coming from you, but look at the actual originating server." I squinted at the screen. The sending domain was not my personal email provider. It was a custom subdomain. It was registered directly to JW Living, my mother's interior design firm. She had not just set up a forwarding alias like she had claimed to Ronan. She had meticulously created a mirrored account to impersonate me. She was actively sending legally binding directives, canceling my choices, and signing documents under my name from her own corporate server. While I was still trying to process the sheer scale of the deception, my cell phone rang again. This time, it was Nora Bell. Nora is my father's younger sister and a retired estate lawyer. She is a woman who spent 40 years dealing with contested wills, hidden assets, and the absolute worst behavior families can inflict upon one another over money. She does not panic, and she does not exaggerate. "Chloe, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Aunt Nora said, skipping all basic pleasantries. Her voice was low and gravely serious. "Your mother took me out for coffee yesterday afternoon. She asked me a series of highly specific, hypothetical legal questions. She wanted to know exactly how vendor contracts define the primary financial stakeholder. More importantly, she asked me if a venue deposit, paid by one person, could legally be refunded to a third-party corporate entity in the event of a total cancellation by the bride." The air in my kitchen suddenly felt incredibly thin. I struggled to pull a full breath into my lungs. "Why would she ask you that, Aunt Nora?" "Because she is looking for a loophole." "Chloe," Nora replied firmly, "people do not ask estate lawyers about redirecting third-party refunds unless they are actively planning to move a very large sum of money. You need to look at your bank statements right now." I put Nora on speakerphone as Ronan walked into the kitchen, dropping his work bag by the door. He took one look at my pale face and immediately rushed over to the table. I frantically logged into our joint wedding budget spreadsheet and pulled up the corresponding credit card statements. We began cross-referencing every single charge over the past 2 months. It took Ronan less than 5 minutes to find the anomaly. He pointed to a cleared transaction buried in the middle of page 3. It was a charge for $850, labeled as a priority rush redesign fee by our wedding planners agency. "Chloe," Ronan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "look at the payment method for this specific fee. It does not match our current joint account. It does not match your active credit card." I stared at the last 4 digits of the card used for the transaction. My stomach violently turned over. It was the number of an old, high-yield rewards card I had completely paid off and supposedly closed over 6 months ago. The physical plastic card had been sitting in the back of my old desk drawer, a drawer my mother had graciously offered to help me pack up into boxes during our recent house renovations. She had stolen my old credit card number right out of my bedroom, kept it active, and was using it to quietly fund the hidden administrative fees of her hostile takeover without triggering alerts on my daily banking app. A profound, suffocating sense of violation washed over me. I spent the next 3 hours locked in a frantic digital war. I changed every single password on my personal accounts. I instituted two-factor authentication on my phone and my email. I froze the old credit card. I systematically called the florist, the rental company, the caterer, and the venue, explicitly demanding that they place a hard verbal password on my account and requiring them to confirm any future changes directly with my actual voice. But the terrifying reality was that the damage was already deeply ingrained in the system. When I spoke to the rental manager, he sounded annoyed and incredibly confused. He told me that Judith had explicitly warned him I was suffering from severe bridal anxiety. She had preemptively told all the vendors that my erratic behavior might lead me to suddenly change my mind or lock my accounts, and that they should gracefully ignore my panic and simply defer to her corporate office for the final, rational decisions. She had built a perfect psychological firewall around her actions. She had positioned herself as the only stable, reliable adult in the room. Later that night, long after Tessa had gone home to her war room, Ronan and I sat in the dark living room. The only light came from the street lamp outside our window. I was exhausted, crying silent tears into the shoulder of his shirt. Tessa had called him privately while I was in the shower. I knew this because Ronan told me the truth the moment I walked out. He looked at me with an intensity that broke my heart. Tessa wanted me to be completely straight with you, and she is entirely right, Ronan said softly, stroking my damp hair. Chloe, you have to stop looking at this as a disagreement over flowers or a mother who just wants to show off her wealth. This is not a family conflict anymore. This is a premeditated, highly organized campaign of total control. She is systematically stripping away your authority, your money, and your reputation. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut as hard as I could, desperately trying to block out the undeniable evidence. A small, pathetic, deeply ingrained part of me still clung to the absolute final shred of hope. I wanted to believe that she was just a ruthless perfectionist. I wanted to believe that she simply could not stand the idea of a Watson wedding looking anything less than $1 million magazine spread. I told Ronan that maybe she just wanted to force my hand on the aesthetics. I told him that a mother, no matter how controlling or narcissistic, would never actually destroy her own child's wedding day. I held on to that fragile, naive hope for exactly 2 more days. It completely shattered the moment I logged into my synchronized calendar app to check the timing for the final dress fitting. A new, automatically synced event had populated on my schedule, pulled from the fake email address she had been using to impersonate me. It was a confirmed appointment with the general manager of Juniper Hall. It was booked for a private, final walkthrough of the premises. It was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning, on the exact day of my wedding. She had not told me about it. She had not invited me. There was absolutely no logistical reason for a mother of the bride to conduct a solitary walkthrough of an empty venue just hours before the ceremony began. Unless she needed to ensure the space was completely clear. I stared at the glowing screen, the final piece of the puzzle locking into place with a sickening click. She was not planning to attend my wedding. She was planning to stand in the center of an empty room and admire her own destructive work. Exactly 6 days before I was supposed to put on my white dress, the floor completely disappeared from beneath my feet. It was a Monday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement in my chest. I decided to make a quick routine phone call to my wedding planner, Celia Pike. I just wanted to verbally confirm the exact arrival window for the lighting technicians on Saturday morning. It was supposed to be a simple, 30-second conversation. Celia answered on the 3rd ring. She did not greet me with her usual bubbly professional enthusiasm. She sounded deeply confused, her voice tight and hesitant. "Chloe?" Celia asked, the sharp edge of panic bleeding through the phone line. "Why are you asking about the lighting schedule? We processed the master cancellation order 48 hours ago." I stopped breathing. The ceramic mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor, sending cold coffee splattering across my bare ankles. I asked her to repeat herself. I asked her what she meant by a master cancellation. Celia took a ragged breath. She told me that every single vendor contract under our master package had been completely voided. Juniper Hall was gone. The florists had stopped sourcing the white orchids. The rental company had released the velvet chairs and the crystal candelabras back into their general inventory. The acoustic string quartet was rebooked for a corporate gala. The shuttle buses were canceled. The stage setup crew was dismissed. The entire catering order was halted. Everything was gone because, according to Celia's system, the formal cancellation directives had come directly from the bride herself. My vision blurred at the edges. I dropped to my knees amidst the broken ceramic shards, frantically pulling up the centralized vendor portal on my laptop. I tore through the communication logs. There they were. Dozens of emails. Perfectly timed. Systematically shutting down my wedding piece by piece. They were terrifyingly flawless. The messages bore my exact digital signature. They used my specific email signature block. They even mimicked my specific professional cadence, using phrases like, "per our previous discussion," and "please confirm receipt," language I used every single day at the insurance firm. My mother had not just forged my name. She had studied my written voice for months to perfectly impersonate me. I asked Celia about the money. I knew we had transferred tens of thousands of dollars into the master account. Celia explained, her voice trembling with pity, that a significant portion of the funds was permanently lost due to the strict 30-day cancellation penalties. However, the remaining balance, the heavily negotiated refund credits, had not simply vanished. The emails from my fraudulent account had explicitly requested that all remaining funds be redirected and dispersed via certified checks to a new secondary vendor. They were entirely pending release to JW Living. I disconnected the call. I did not cry. I was entirely consumed by a cold, blinding terror. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's number. It was the first time in my entire life I had ever called her with pure, unfiltered rage burning in my throat. She answered immediately, her tone breezy and perfectly collected. "Hello, darling," she sang into the receiver. "How is your Monday?" "What did you do?" I demanded, my voice shaking so violently the phone rattled against my ear. "You canceled the venue. You canceled the flowers. You canceled everything. You stole my wedding." I braced myself for her usual tactics. I expected her to play the victim, to feign absolute ignorance, to spin a wild lie about a massive vendor bankruptcy or a tragic administrative error. But the gaslighting had stopped. She did not deny a single thing. "I did what had to be done, Chloe," Judith said. Her voice was no longer sweet. It was dead, flat, and absolute. "I would rather tear this entire event down to the studs than watch you throw your life away on a mediocre performance. You were completely embarrassing this family. You forged my signature. You diverted the refunds to your own business," I screamed, the raw sound tearing at my vocal cords. "I am reclaiming my own investment," she replied icily. "Ronan is entirely inadequate. He is a contractor with a modest bungalow and a hopelessly common background. He is not of the caliber for the Watson family. I tried to elevate this pathetic little party into something respectable, but you fought me at every single turn. So, I am putting an end to it. If you insist on rushing forward like a stubborn, ungrateful child, you will learn the severe consequences of defying your family. There is no wedding. It is over." She hung up the phone. I sat on the kitchen floor, staring blindly at the blank screen of my device. The true devastation washing over me had absolutely nothing to do with the lost money, the canceled venue, or the sheer public humiliation of a broken engagement. It was the horrific, undeniable confirmation of who my mother truly was. For 31 years, I had made excuses for her. I had convinced myself that her controlling nature was just a twisted manifestation of maternal love. But sitting in that puddle of cold coffee, I finally heard the absolute truth. I heard my own mother proudly admit that she possessed the power to utterly destroy my happiness, and worse, she felt entirely justified in doing it. She did not view me as a daughter. She viewed me as an asset that had suddenly depreciated in value. Ronan found me on the floor 20 minutes later. He did not ask what happened. He took one look at my face, gently pulled me into his arms, and let me sob until I physically could not produce another tear. What struck me the most in that moment was his profound stillness. He did not rage. He did not punch the wall or scream curses at my mother. He held me with a calm that was almost unnerving. He was not a man panicking over a ruined wedding. He was a man who had finally identified the true enemy and was quietly preparing for the fallout. Less than an hour later, the front door flew open. Tessa marched into the living room. She did not knock. She took one look at my red, swollen eyes and Ronan's stony expression, and she knew the bomb had finally detonated. She dropped her heavy leather bag onto the coffee table with a loud thud. She pointed a sharp, commanding finger directly at my face. "I need exactly 24 hours, Tessa said, her voice cracking like a whip through the heavy silence of the room. "You are not going to call another vendor. You are not going to post a single sad, cryptic message on social media. You are not going to answer any phone calls from your extended family. And most importantly, you are going to have no contact at all with Judith Watson. She needs to believe she has completely broken you. She needs to believe she has won." I looked at Tessa, my mind numb, my body exhausted. I asked her what the point of fighting was if the venue was already gone and the money was locked in a corporate dispute. Tessa did not answer me immediately. Instead, she unclasped the heavy brass buckles of her leather briefcase. She pulled out a massive, thick binder, overflowing with color-coded tabs, printed contracts, and architectural floor plans. She slammed it down onto the coffee table right in front of me. Tessa looked me dead in the eye, a fierce, unapologetic grin slowly spreading across her face. "Chloe," Tessa said, tapping the heavy binder with her knuckles. "I did not wait until today to start saving this wedding." Tessa flipped the heavy cover of the binder open. The very first page was a glossy, high-resolution photograph of a place I had never seen before. It was an absolutely stunning space. It was not a polished greenhouse like Juniper Hall. It was an old, beautifully weathered freight train depot called Foxmere Station. The structure was a magnificent skeleton of raw steel beams, exposed red brick, and massive, floor-to-ceiling glass panes that let the natural light pour into the cavernous room. It possessed an industrial, grounded soul that instantly resonated with me. It was not delicate or fragile. It was incredibly strong, built to withstand heavy burdens, and it felt exactly like the kind of place where I wanted to start my marriage. "I secured the lease on this property 3 weeks ago," Tessa stated, her voice entirely devoid of panic. "I paid the holding fee out of my own corporate account because I knew your mother was systematically dismantling your original plan. Foxmere is ours for the entire weekend." I stared at the photograph, completely paralyzed. Tessa turned the page. The next section was a meticulously color-coded spreadsheet. She had not just found a backup venue, she had quietly assembled an entire shadow army. She had secure holds placed with an independent florist, a boutique catering company, a lively jazz trio, a documentary-style photographer, a dedicated setup crew, and a highly professional private security firm. "Every single vendor on this list is completely loyal to me," Tessa explained, tapping the paper with a manicured fingernail. "They are fully briefed on the situation. They do not know Judith Watson, and they are standing by, ready to be activated within 72 hours. We are not canceling your wedding. Chloe, we are relocating it." Ronan did not ask a single question. He simply pulled his cell phone from his pocket, walked straight onto the back porch, and started making calls. He possessed a massive network of loyal friends from his years working in local construction and contracting. Within 30 minutes, he had secured 5 cargo vans, 10 strong men to handle the heavy logistical lifting, and a massive portable generator just in case Foxmere Station experienced any unexpected electrical issues. Back inside, Tessa flipped to the third section of the binder. My breath caught sharply in my throat. It was not the sterile, towering white orchids, or the heavy velvet chairs my mother had forced upon me. Tessa had meticulously printed out the original digital mood board I had sent to her almost 10 months ago. There were crisp photographs of mismatched amber glass bottles catching the afternoon sunlight. There were fabric swatches of warm gray linen. There were sketches of wild daisies mixed with fresh olive branches, and a beautifully minimalist dinner menu printed on heavy, recycled cotton paper. Tessa had saved every single detail I truly wanted. She had preserved the absolute core of my vision while my mother was busy trying to erase me. I buried my face in my hands, letting the hot, heavy tears fall freely. I was not crying out of grief anymore. I was crying out of profound relief and overwhelming gratitude. The fragile moment of peace was abruptly shattered by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. It was Aunt Nora. I answered the call and put her directly on speakerphone, setting the device down on the wooden kitchen table next to Tessa's master binder. "Chloe, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to stay absolutely calm," Nora commanded. Her voice possessed the razor-sharp edge of a seasoned litigator preparing for a massive trial. "I spent the entire morning pulling favors at the regional banking center. I managed to track the routing numbers associated with the initial cancellation orders your mother submitted." My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What did you find?" "Aunt Nora, 2 of the initial vendor refunds have already cleared," Nora stated flatly. "The caterer and the string quartet processed their penalty returns yesterday afternoon. Those funds did not float into a holding account. They were directly deposited into the primary business checking account of JW Living LLC. She did not just request the money. Chloe, she physically took it." The entire room went completely silent. Ronan stepped back inside from the porch, the screen door clicking shut behind him. He looked at the phone, his jaw locked tight. "That is fraud," Ronan said, his voice dangerously low. "That is straight theft." "It is exactly that," Nora confirmed. "She forged your digital signature to cancel the contracts, and she intentionally diverted your personal funds into her corporate entity. This completely removes the situation from the realm of an emotional family dispute over wedding aesthetics. Your mother has committed a documented, highly traceable financial crime." A sudden, blinding surge of adrenaline rushed through my veins. The lifetime of conditioning, the deeply ingrained instinct to keep the peace and swallow my anger, completely evaporated. I grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter. I wanted to drive straight to her pristine, perfectly decorated office downtown. I wanted to kick the glass door open, slam the bank statements onto her polished mahogany desk, and demand she look me in the eye and explain why she stole from her own daughter. Tessa shot out of her chair and physically blocked the front door. She grabbed my shoulders, her grip tight and unyielding. "Absolutely not," Tessa ordered, staring fiercely into my eyes. "If you drive down there right now and scream at her, you will lose the only major advantage we currently possess. Right now, Judith firmly believes she has won. She thinks you are sitting on this floor, crying, entirely defeated. If you tell her we know about the routed money, she will immediately log into her servers. She will delete the forged email accounts. She will falsify new invoices to make the refunds look like legitimate design consultation fees. She will call every single vendor in town and spin a story that makes you look completely insane. You cannot give her the chance to burn the evidence." I stood there, my chest heaving, the keys digging painfully into the palm of my hand. I knew Tessa was absolutely right. My mother was a master manipulator. If she smelled smoke, she would burn the entire forest down to cover her tracks. Ronan gently placed his hand over mine, prying the metal keys from my rigid fingers. He pulled me away from the door and wrapped his arms around my waist, anchoring me completely. "Chloe, look at me," Ronan said softly. I lifted my chin, meeting his steady, unwavering gaze. "For your entire life, you have acted as the human shield for her terrible behavior. You have absorbed her insults. You have covered up her manipulations, and you have constantly bent over backwards to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. I need you to promise me something right now. I need you to promise me that you are done protecting her." He was asking me to sever the heaviest chain I had ever carried. He was asking me to stop being the compliant, terrified daughter and finally let the terrible weight of my mother's choices fall squarely onto her own shoulders. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I looked at the man who was fighting so fiercely to build a life with me, and I looked at the best friend who had single-handedly built a fortress to protect my joy. "I promise," I whispered, the words tasting like pure freedom on my tongue. "I am done." I walked back over to the kitchen table. Nora had emailed over a series of formal legal affidavits, detailing the timeline of the forged signatures and the unauthorized redirection of my personal funds. I sat down in the wooden chair, picked up a heavy black pen, and carefully read through every single line of the documents. My hand did not shake. I signed my actual name, pressing the ink firmly into the paper. I authorized Nora to begin compiling the evidence for a formal civil action, to be filed the moment the wedding weekend concluded. I handed the signed papers to Tessa, who carefully slid them into a secure plastic sleeve at the back of her master binder. I looked out the kitchen window at the bright afternoon sun. For the very first time in my 31 years of life, I was making a massive, life-altering decision without seeking Judith Watson's approval, without fearing her retaliation, and without begging for her permission. I was going to marry the love of my life in exactly 6 days, surrounded by wild daisies and amber glass, and my mother was never going to know a single thing about it. My mother was a woman who fundamentally misunderstood silence. To her, silence from an opponent always meant total unconditional surrender. Because I had not called her back screaming into the telephone, because I had not posted a frantic, emotionally devastated manifesto on the internet. She assumed I was lying in a dark room, completely crushed under the weight of her absolute authority. Believing she had successfully broken my spirit and taught me a permanent lesson, Judith decided it was the perfect time to collect her public sympathy. She began her victory lap with a highly calculated digital performance. On Tuesday morning, precisely 4 days before the ceremony was supposed to happen, my social media feeds became a curated exhibition of her fabricated grief. She posted a long, melancholic status update featuring a professionally shot, black-and-white photograph of a lone, drooping white rose. The caption was an absolute masterpiece of manipulative vague booking. She wrote extensively about the profound, excruciating agony of watching a beloved child make deeply immature financial decisions. She asked her hundreds of followers for their thoughts and prayers as she navigated the incredibly heavy burden of a heartbroken mother trying her best to clean up a disastrous, humiliating mess. Within a 2-hour period, the comments section flooded with her high society friends offering their blind support and validating her entirely fictional suffering. She did not stop at the public internet. She started reaching out directly into the guest list. She sent private, hushed messages to the distant relatives and the affluent socialites she had forced onto the roster. She adopted a tone of tragic confidentiality, heavily implying that the wedding might be severely delayed or completely canceled due to my erratic, unstable behavior. She planted the seed perfectly, making absolutely sure that when Saturday arrived and the doors of Juniper Hall remained permanently locked, everyone would blame the ungrateful bride, not the devoted mother. Her arrogance rapidly escalated from the digital world to the physical one. On Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting at my desk when the internal phone line buzzed. It was the front lobby receptionist. Her voice was uncomfortably high-pitched and strained. She informed me that my mother was currently standing in the center of the main atrium, causing a highly unusual disturbance. I walked out of my office and stood quietly on the second-floor mezzanine, looking down at the expansive marble lobby of Harbor and Wren Assurance. Judith was wearing a pristine cashmere coat, speaking in an artificially loud, dramatic whisper to the terrified young woman behind the security desk. "My daughter is experiencing a severe psychological break due to wedding stress," my mother announced, ensuring her voice carried toward the nearby elevators where several of my colleagues were standing. "She is completely incapable of managing her daily affairs right now. I need you to immediately route any incoming calls from event vendors, florists, or caterers directly to my personal cell phone." We must intercept these triggers to prevent her from totally collapsing at her desk. It was a calculated, devastating strike aimed directly at my professional credibility. Fortunately, the Human Resources Director, who already had a formal file regarding her previous anonymous harassment call, intervened before I even had to walk down the stairs. He politely but firmly escorted my mother out of the revolving glass doors, explicitly threatening to involve building security if she ever returned to the premises. I stood there, gripping the cold glass railing, my face burning with a profound, suffocating humiliation. A week ago, that level of public embarrassment would have sent me into a desperate spiral of apologies. Now, it only hardened the ice running through my veins. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that she wanted me entirely destroyed. While my mother was busy digging my grave in public, I was quietly solidifying my actual family in private. That same evening, Ronan and I drove over to the boutique hotel where his mother, Elaine Hale, had just checked in for the wedding week. Elaine had been quietly wavering. She loved me, but my mother's insidious, poison-laced phone calls had planted genuine, terrifying seeds of doubt in her mind regarding my financial stability and my basic honesty. I did not offer Elaine an emotional plea or a tearful defense. I offered her the absolute, documented truth. We sat at the small round table in her hotel room, and I placed a heavy dark blue binder right in front of her. It contained every single medical bill from my father's severe stroke, the original loan agreements, the grueling payment schedules for my 3 separate jobs, and the final, certified letters proving that every single account was completely paid in full and permanently closed years ago. Elaine put on her reading glasses and meticulously reviewed the documents. The quiet, gentle retired teacher read through the undeniable evidence of a daughter sacrificing everything for her father, and the horrifying realization of how Judith had twisted that beautiful sacrifice washed over her face. Elaine took her glasses off, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She did not say a single bad word about my mother. She simply reached into her leather travel bag and pulled out a small, antique velvet box. "Ronan's grandmother wore this on her wedding day," Elaine said softly, opening the lid to reveal a delicate silver filigree brooch set with a single, brilliant sapphire. She reached across the table and pressed it firmly into the palm of my hand. "We do not deal in conditions or financial tests in our family. Chloe, you belong with us. I am so incredibly proud that you are marrying my son." In that single, quiet moment, Elaine Hale offered me more maternal grace and unconditional trust than I had experienced in my entire 31 years of life. Behind the scenes, the shadow war was reaching its absolute peak. Tessa was executing a logistical miracle. She had initiated the massive, highly covert operation of rerouting over 180 trusted guests to Foxmere Station. She categorized the guest list into strict tiers of trust. She utilized secure, blind-copied emails and direct one-on-one phone calls, explicitly instructing everyone that the location had changed due to a massive, last-minute venue emergency. She instituted a strict communication blackout protocol. Guests were explicitly forbidden from replying in any massive group chats, tagging any location on social media, or mentioning a single word to anyone associated with Judith Watson. The sudden, eerie silence and the strange, quiet shifts in the local vendor ecosystem did not go entirely unnoticed. A prominent reporter from a local Asheville lifestyle magazine, a woman who frequently covered high society events and had previously interviewed my mother for her interior design work, caught a whiff of the massive cancellation. The reporter managed to acquire a few leaked text messages regarding the venue swap and reached out directly to Tessa, fishing aggressively for an exclusive story about the spectacular, messy collapse of a Watson family wedding. Tessa, operating with the cold, calculating precision of a military general, politely declined to comment. She knew the media was a devastatingly powerful weapon, but she also knew that firing it too early would give my mother time to spin the narrative and paint herself as the victim once again. Tessa deliberately kept the reporter waiting in the dark, preserving the impending scandal as a lethal trump card to be played only when the timing was absolutely flawless. On Thursday night, exactly 48 hours before I was set to walk down the aisle. My cell phone screen lit up in the dark bedroom. It was a new voicemail notification from Judith. I put it on speakerphone so Ronan could hear it too. There was no background noise on the recording. Her voice was incredibly calm, dripping with a terrifying, patronizing certainty. She truly believed I was sitting in the ruins of my life, utterly shattered by her disciplinary actions. "Chloe," my mother said smoothly into the receiver, "I know you are hurting right now. But when the dust settles and everything completely collapses around you, you will finally understand that your mother was entirely right. You will thank me for saving you from yourself. Call me when you are ready to apologize." The message clicked off, leaving a heavy, loaded silence in the room. Ronan looked at me, a slight, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I reached out, deleted the voicemail entirely, and turned my phone completely off. She was absolutely right about one thing. A massive collapse was definitely coming. She just had no idea she was the one standing directly underneath it. The final pieces of the puzzle did not fall from the sky. They were carefully pulled from the dirt by my Aunt Nora. On Friday morning, exactly 24 hours before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, Nora arrived at Tessa's downtown loft, carrying a sleek leather briefcase and a look of profound, icy satisfaction. She did not bother sitting down. She stood right in the center of the living room, unclasped the brass locks, and pulled out a thick stack of printed financial ledgers. Through her extensive network of retired legal colleagues and regional banking executives, Nora had quietly pulled the curtain entirely back on JW Living. The pristine, high society facade my mother projected to the world was completely rotting from the inside out. Her boutique interior design firm was bleeding money at a catastrophic rate. The rent on her glamorous downtown studio space was over 3 months past due. Even worse, the bank had unexpectedly called in a massive 6-figure home equity line of credit early, demanding immediate repayment that she simply did not possess. "Look at the dates, Chloe," Nora instructed, sliding a highlighted spreadsheet across the glass coffee table. The vendor penalty refunds from the caterer and the string quartet cleared into her corporate account on Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, those exact funds were wired directly to a commercial real estate holding group to cover her delinquent studio rent. She did not cancel your wedding purely out of spite or because she thought Ronan was beneath our family. She canceled your wedding because she was drowning in debt, and she needed your deposit money to throw herself a lifeline. The revelation hit me like a physical blow to the chest. For my entire life, I had believed my mother's cruelty was born from an obsessive, twisted desire for perfection. I thought she ruined things because they did not meet her impossible standards. But this was so much colder, so much more pathetic. She was willing to completely destroy the most important day of my life just to cover her own financial incompetence. The realization stripped away the last lingering shred of guilt I held. I was not a daughter defying a loving mother. I was a victim quietly cornered by a desperate thief. While we were reviewing the bank logs, Tessa's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a direct call from the general manager of Juniper Hall. Tessa put it on speakerphone. The manager sounded deeply uncomfortable. He explained that Judith had called him 3 times that morning, aggressively demanding a physical paper check for the remaining $6,000 in floral and structural decor credits. She had explicitly requested to meet him at the venue at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon on Saturday to finalize the heartbreaking paperwork and close the account completely. Nora let out a low, sharp laugh. It was a sound devoid of any humor. "That is the key," Nora said, her eyes gleaming with the predatory focus of a master litigator. "We do not have to drag her into a confrontation. We do not have to trick her into showing up. If Judith firmly believes there is one last paycheck sitting on a table waiting for her, she will eagerly walk right through the front doors of Juniper Hall completely on her own." Tessa did not waste a single second. She immediately shifted from event planner to military tactician. She put together a careful plan right under my mother's nose. Tessa explicitly instructed the venue manager to agree to the meeting. Then, she started making calls to assemble the audience. She reached out to our original wedding planner, Celia Pike. She called the lead representative from the floral company and the logistics director from the rental agency. Finally, Nora pulled her ultimate trump card. She arranged for a certified bank fraud investigator to attend the meeting as an independent witness. They scheduled the grand final refund authorization signing for 3:30 in the afternoon on my wedding day, right in the main glass conference room of Juniper Hall, to ensure nothing could possibly go wrong. Tessa spent the rest of the afternoon building a massive paper trail. She sat at her computer, printing every single document we had collected over the past week. She printed the raw metadata from the fake email address. She printed the forged digital signatures side by side with my actual legal signature. She printed the authorized bank transfer logs, the recorded cancellation receipts, and the call logs showing exactly when my mother had contacted the various vendors posing as my primary coordinator. She organized everything into pristine, heavily tabbed manila folders. It was a detailed file documenting exactly what she had done. While the meeting at Juniper Hall was being set up, Tessa made sure the real wedding stayed private and secure. Foxmere Station had discreet security at the entrances, no public signage, and a check-in team working from an updated guest list. The shuttle route was changed to keep the location quiet and prevent any last-minute interference. I spent the final night of my engagement sleeping in the guest bedroom of Tessa's spacious loft. I did not go back to the bungalow I shared with Ronan. We wanted to honor the tradition of spending the night apart, even amidst the chaos. The loft was quiet, smelling of lavender and the herbal tea Tessa had brewed for me. I did not open my laptop. I did not check my social media feeds to see if my mother had posted any more tragic, fabricated stories about my supposed mental collapse. My cell phone remained entirely powered down, locked securely inside my overnight bag. I lay in the dark, staring up at the high industrial ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the city traffic below. I expected to feel terrified. I expected to feel the familiar suffocating grip of anxiety that always accompanied any conflict with my mother, but my chest felt incredibly light. For the first time in 31 years, my mind was entirely clear, entirely focused on the man I was going to marry in less than 24 hours. I was not thinking about the velvet chairs, or the white orchids, or the socialites who would not be attending. I was just thinking about Ronan, standing under a massive glass roof, waiting for me. Every single gear had clicked perfectly into place. The board was set. The pieces were locked. Somewhere across the city, my mother was likely picking out a flawless designer coat, practicing her deeply solemn, grieving expression in the mirror. She truly believed she was going to spend her Saturday afternoon collecting the final thousands of dollars from the ashes of my ruined life, standing victorious in an empty room, waiting for me to ultimately break down and beg for her forgiveness. She was entirely convinced she had successfully orchestrated my spectacular fall. She had no idea she was walking straight into the consequences of her own actions. The morning of my wedding broke with a brilliant, unseasonable warmth. The sky over North Carolina was a piercing, cloudless blue, carrying the crisp scent of pine and drying dew. By the time the sun was fully above the horizon, Tessa's backup plan was already in motion. Deep in the secluded woods, 30 miles outside the city, over 180 trusted friends and family members were safely unloaded from unmarked private shuttles. They were ushered through the heavy steel doors of Foxmere Station, completely shielded from the chaos my mother thought she had orchestrated. When I finally stepped out of the bridal suite and looked down from the iron mezzanine, my breath completely left my lungs. The space was profoundly, achingly beautiful. It possessed a raw, grounding magic that far exceeded any sterile, magazine-ready version my mother had tried to force upon me. Sunlight poured heavily through the massive, slanted glass roof of the old freight depot, casting long, golden geometric shadows across the original brick floors. Strings of delicate, warm-toned fairy lights were woven tightly around the black iron beams overhead, creating the illusion of a sky full of captured stars. Below, the long communal dining tables were draped in soft, heavy gray linen. Instead of towering, intimidating floral structures that blocked conversation, The centerpieces were low, sprawling, and beautifully wild. There were clusters of fresh white daisies, sprigs of fragrant rosemary, and sprawling branches of silver-green olive leaves. Nestled between the greenery were dozens of mismatched amber glass bottles, glowing warmly from the light of hand-poured, honey-colored beeswax candles. It was exactly the vision I had held in my heart for nearly a year. It was a space that felt like a deep, collective exhale. I walked slowly down the iron staircase, trailing my fingers along the railing, and approached the nearest dining table. Tessa was standing there, making a micro-adjustment to a folded linen napkin. She stepped aside and gestured silently toward the place setting. I looked down and felt hot. Thick tears well up instantly in my eyes. Resting perfectly on the center of the dark ceramic plate was a simple, heavy cotton menu card. Tessa had not just recreated the meal plan. She had dug through her digital archives and found the exact, slightly imperfect typewriter font I had selected for my very first mood board. She had saved the color codes, the spacing, and the specific texture of the paper. Looking at that small piece of cardstock, I felt a profound sense of restoration. For months, my mother had systematically tried to erase my identity, replacing my choices with her own corporate branding until I barely recognized my own wedding. But sitting right there, printed in black ink, was the undeniable proof that the woman I actually was had survived the siege. An hour later, I retreated back to the suite to put on my dress. I did not have a chaotic, screaming room full of frantic bridesmaids. I had Tessa, quietly managing the radio earpiece for the security detail, and Elaine Hale. Elaine stood behind me as I stepped into the simple, flowing ivory silk gown. Her hands were incredibly gentle, weathered from years of teaching kindergarten, as she carefully guided the delicate pearl buttons through their loops down the small of my back. She did not criticize my posture. She did not offer unsolicited advice about my hair. She did not treat my body like a mannequin being prepped for a high society window display. She just smoothed the heavy silk over my shoulders and kissed my cheek softly. Standing there in the quiet room, feeling the absolute safety of Elaine's presence, a quiet revelation washed over me. I realized, with a sharp pang of both grief and profound relief, that motherhood did not inherently require control. Love did not have to be a transactional currency, and guidance did not have to feel like a cage. Elaine was simply present, offering nothing but warmth and steady support. When the acoustic string quartet began playing a slow, resonant melody from the main floor, Aunt Nora opened the heavy wooden door of the suite. She offered me her arm. We walked together down the long, dim corridor leading to the main hall. The heavy doors swung open, and the bright, amber-lit sanctuary of Foxmere Station spread out before me. Every single face in the room turned toward the entrance. They were not corporate sponsors or distant socialites judging the floral budget. They were people who truly loved Ronan and me. Nora walked with me for the first half of the long, reclaimed wood aisle. Her presence was a fierce, protective shield. But right as we reached the center of the room, I gently placed my hand over hers and stopped. I smiled at my aunt, silently communicating my immense gratitude. Nora squeezed my fingers, nodded once with deep understanding, and gracefully stepped away to take her seat in the front row. I took a deep breath, the scent of rosemary and warm wax filling my lungs, and I walked the final half of the aisle entirely alone. It was not a walk of isolation. It was a deliberate, powerful declaration of independence. For my entire life, I had operated under the paralyzing belief that I needed Judith Watson's permission to exist, to make choices, and to be happy. Walking those last 20 steps by myself was the physical manifestation of severing that invisible leash. I was choosing my own future. At the end of the aisle, standing under a massive arch of wild olive branches, was Ronan. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his hands clasped casually in front of him. As I approached, his gray eyes locked onto mine, shining with an intense, quiet pride. He did not look at me like a distressed damsel he had just rescued from a burning building. He looked at me like a formidable partner, an absolute equal who had fought through hell to stand by his side. When I finally reached him, he took both of my hands in his grip warm and anchoring. The ceremony was incredibly grounding, filled with shared laughter and spoken promises that felt entirely real. But even as the officiant spoke about trust and endurance, a razor-thin wire of tension still hummed beneath the beautiful surface. We all knew the storm had not yet made landfall. We were simply standing in the eye of it. In the front row, Tessa sat with impeccable posture. Her heavily encrypted cell phone rested quietly in her lap, facing upward. Exactly 10 minutes into the exchange of our vows, the screen briefly illuminated. It was a secure text message routed from the general manager over at Juniper Hall, miles away in the center of the city. The message contained only 3 words. Judith just arrived. Tessa did not flinch. She did not draw any attention to herself. She calmly flipped the phone face down against the dark fabric of her dress. She was a master of timing. She refused to let my mother's shadow cross the threshold of my ceremony. She let the music play. She let Ronan slide the plain gold band onto my finger. She let the officiant pronounce us husband and wife, allowing the vows to be perfectly sealed before the heavy iron gates of the past were permanently locked behind us. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant announced, his voice echoing warmly through the cavernous glass room. Ronan pulled me in close, wrapping his arms around my waist, and kissed me deeply. The entire room erupted into a massive, deafening wave of joyous applause, cheers, and the stomping of feet against the floorboards. It was the sound of absolute victory. We pulled away, laughing, my hands resting flat against the lapels of his suit jacket. The joy in my chest was so immense I felt like I could float. But the moment the final note of the recessional music swelled, I felt a sharp, purposeful tap on my shoulder. I turned around. Tessa was standing right behind me. The joyous smile was entirely gone from her face, replaced by the cold, thrilling focus of a predator watching a trap snap shut. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that only Ronan and I could hear over the roaring crowd. "It is time." We slipped out through the heavy iron doors of Foxmere Station just as the jazz trio struck up their first lively set for the cocktail hour. I did not bother changing out of my ivory silk gown. Ronan was still wearing his sharp charcoal suit, the wild daisy boutonniere pinned perfectly to his lapel. Tessa and Aunt Nora followed closely behind us, their expressions set in identical masks of absolute chilling resolve. We climbed into the back of a waiting black SUV and drove the 30 miles back into the city limits. The ride was completely silent. I watched the pine trees blur past the tinted windows, feeling my heartbeat steady into a calm, rhythmic drum. I was not the terrified girl who had cried on her kitchen floor 6 days ago. I was a wife returning to finish a war. We arrived at Juniper Hall exactly 10 minutes before 3:30 in the afternoon. The massive glass greenhouse was entirely empty, the afternoon sun reflecting off the polished concrete floors where my reception was originally supposed to be held. The venue manager met us at the entrance, his face pale and tightly drawn, and led us silently up the floating steel staircase to the executive glass conference room on the second floor. The room was already full. Sitting around the long mahogany table was an assembly of the very people my mother had manipulated. Celia Pike, my former wedding planner, sat near the head of the table, clutching a thick manila folder. Next to her was the lead representative from the floral company and the logistics director from the rental agency. At the far end sat a sharp-eyed man in a navy suit, the certified bank fraud investigator Nora had brought in, seated right beside a highly aggressive civil litigation attorney. Ronan pulled out a high-backed leather chair for me right in the center of the room. I sat down, smoothing the heavy silk of my wedding dress over my knees. Tessa stood directly behind my right shoulder, her arms crossed firmly over her chest. Nora stood to my left. We waited. At precisely 3:30, the heavy glass door swung open. Judith Watson walked into the room wearing a flawless, sharply tailored emerald green coat, carrying her designer leather handbag. Her chin was tilted high, her lips pressed into a thin, somber line, perfectly performing the role of the tragic, long-suffering matriarch, arriving to sweep up the final ashes of her daughter's mistakes. She expected to find the venue manager holding a certified paper check. Instead, she found me sitting in my wedding dress, with every professional she had misled already waiting in the room. My mother stopped completely dead in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured hand hovered over the polished brass door handle. The artificial color drained instantly from her face, leaving her looking starkly pale and suddenly very old under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. Nobody offered her a greeting. Nobody offered her a seat. The civil litigation attorney spoke first. He did not introduce himself. He simply slid a thick, bound dossier directly across the smooth mahogany wood. It stopped exactly inches from my mother's fingertips. "Judith Watson," the lawyer stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We are here to formally review the unauthorized cancellation of the Watson-Hale wedding contracts and the subsequent illegal diversion of penalty funds into the corporate accounts of J.W. Living." Celia Pike opened her manila folder. She did not look intimidated anymore. She looked furious. She placed a stack of printed emails onto the table. "These are the cancellation directives you sent, using a forged digital signature," Celia said flatly. "You impersonated my client to systematically void thousands of dollars in active service contracts." The bank fraud investigator leaned forward, tapping his expensive pen against a printed financial ledger. "And these are the routing numbers confirming that you requested the remaining credit balances be issued not back to the original payer, but directly into your own commercial real estate holding accounts. We have the exact timestamps showing you used those stolen funds to cover delinquent rent on your design studio less than 24 hours after the transfer cleared." Judith stared at the papers, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit, searching for a sympathetic face. Finding absolutely none, she defaulted to her oldest, most practiced weapon. Her eyes filled instantly with bright, shimmering tears. Her lower lip began to tremble. "Chloe," she whispered, her voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak, "how could you do this to me? I was only trying to clean up the massive mess you made. You were spiraling out of control. The budget was completely ruined. I stepped in to save our family name from total embarrassment. I am your mother. I was trying to protect you." When the tears failed to draw even a single flinch from me, her sadness evaporated, instantly replaced by a venomous, cornered fury. She slammed her hand against the mahogany table. "You incredibly ungrateful little girl," she spat, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "After everything I sacrificed to build a life for you, you drag me into a room with these strangers to humiliate me over a few administrative errors. You are nothing without my guidance." Ronan did not raise his voice. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, pulled out his cell phone, and set it gently on the table. He pressed a single button. The audio recording was crystal clear, captured during that toxic lunch she had forced upon him weeks ago, her own cold. Calculating voice filled the heavy silence of the conference room. "If I do not control this wedding, there will be no wedding at all." The sound of her own absolute arrogance hung in the air, stripping away any possible defense she had left. She was not a protector. She was a dictator who had been caught red-handed. But the final, fatal blow did not come from the lawyers or the recorded audio. It came from Tessa. Tessa stepped forward, reaching into her leather bag. She pulled out a stack of 5 glossy, high-resolution photographs that had been printed just an hour ago by our on-site photographer. She tossed them onto the table, letting them fan out perfectly in front of my mother. They were live shots from Foxmere Station. There was a photo of me walking down the aisle, the sunlight catching the amber glass bottles. There was a photo of Ronan and me exchanging rings under the wild olive branches. There was a wide shot of the massive, beautiful room, packed with over 180 smiling, joyous guests raising their glasses in a vibrant toast. Judith stared at the photographs, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the reality in front of her. The wedding she had spent months trying to destroy. The event she had risked her entire professional freedom to sabotage had not only survived, it had happened beautifully, flawlessly, and entirely without her. She was completely irrelevant. "I am not going to scream at you," I said quietly, breaking the silence. My voice was steady, anchored by a profound, unshakable peace. "I am not going to cry, and I am absolutely never going to apologize to you again." I stood up slowly, the heavy silk of my gown rustling against the leather chair. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had spent 31 years trying to convince me I was small. "From this exact moment forward, you no longer have a daughter," I told her, the words tasting like pure, unadulterated freedom. "Every single piece of communication regarding the stolen money will go directly through my legal counsel until full financial restitution is made. You no longer have the right to step into my life, my home, or my marriage under the guise of a mother's permission. We are done." I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I did not give her the space to launch into another desperate, theatrical performance. I simply turned my back on her and walked toward the glass door. Ronan stepped right beside me, his hand resting warmly on the small of my back. Tessa and Nora gathered their files and followed us out, leaving Judith Watson standing completely alone in a silent, empty glass room, surrounded by nothing but the damning evidence of her own destruction. We drove back to Foxmere Station just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of violet and gold. When we pushed through the heavy iron doors, the jazz band was playing a slow, soulful melody. The room was bathed in the warm, dripping honey light of 100 beeswax candles. The crowd parted, cheering softly, as Ronan led me directly to the center of the wooden dance floor. He pulled me close, his arms wrapping tightly around me, and we began our first dance. I buried my face against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. For the very first time in my entire life, I was not holding my breath, waiting for the floor to drop out from underneath me. I was simply moving to the music, surrounded by absolute love, finally existing in a beautiful, hard-won freedom that belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your location in the comments below to connect and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, like this video, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more people who need to hear it.